Hello and welcome to Wine Blast. I'm Susie, he's Peter, and we currently have our heads full of orange wine.
Metaphorically full, not literally full. That would be medically concerning, I think, wouldn't it? I mean, we're probably not far off.
Well, yeah, true, but either way, this is the second instalment in our epic two-part focus on orange wine. And it's important to stress a couple of things. Firstly, you don't have to listen to one episode to enjoy and appreciate the other. They stand alone. And secondly, we are loving the experience.
We really are. You know, it's a truly fascinating subject. You know, and I think if we're really honest, we feared this might have been well out of our comfort zone. But we've loved the research and making these shows, tasting these wines, you know, even if we haven't always seen eye to eye. But we'll come on to that.
We will indeed. So yes. In our first orange wine episode, we heard from Simon Wolfe, author of Amber Revolution, How the World Learned to Love Orange Wine. We also talked to Matea Gravner of the iconic Friuli-based orange wine producer Gravner. And we tasted a couple of good value orange wines from Sicily and Slovenia.
And covering orange wine was actually a suggestion from listener David Dowling. He suggested we should feature wines from the Italian-Slovenian border, which we are, and he name-checked Gravner and Radikon as producers of, in his words, some of the finest wines in the world. So Gravner featured in our last episode, as you said, and Saša Radikon is on this one.
So there you go. We listen to you, our lovely listeners, especially when you come up with inspired suggestions. So thanks again, David. Yeah. So let's start off by listening to a couple of quotes we heard last time and a few more that are coming up in this episode.
Just because you start with white grapes doesn't mean you need to end up with something that looks like supermarket Pinot Grigio. There's a whole world of possibilities, and they're much broader and more varied than we ever thought.
Wine should be a pleasure. If it's not a pleasure, then it's better not to drink.
You cannot help but be struck by something which looks just so amazing in the glass. It was as if the molecular structure or nature of my tongue had been rearranged.
Orange wines will stay on the map for forever.
So, in order, that was Simon Wolfe, Matea Gravner, natural wine guru Doug Wregg of UK importer Les Caves de Pyrene, and finally, Saša Radikon.
Now, in the last episode, Simon gave us a really clear introduction to orange wine, which he defined as wine made from white grapes that have been fermented with the skins, like red wine. And he talked about orange wine's long history, both in places like Georgia, but also all over Europe and beyond, and how its revival from the late 1990s onwards proved divisive and controversial. Because people they couldn't get their heads around the style.
Yeah, you know, Simon mentioned how orange wine was part of a cultural shift back to traditional styles and away from ultra-modern winemaking. This went hand in hand with the rise of natural wine. He described orange wine as the poster child for natural wine, which is a lovely thought. The future is bright for orange wine, in his view, as nowadays more and more producers experiment with the technique, hence ever greater diversity. And it's his firm hope that orange wine ends up being a bona fide fourth wine colour or category alongside red, white and rosé.
Then Matea Gravner gave us an intriguing insight into the Gravner story, how her dad, Joško, risked everything after a dramatic conversion away from the pristine modern white wines he had been making because he came to see them as soulless. He transitioned instead to amphora fermented orange wines from the mid-1990s onwards. And it was in a quest for authenticity with his local Ribolla Gialla grapes. And it was a move that ultimately proved very successful.
Both Simon and Matea admitted that orange wine is still a developing category, both in terms of production, but also broader acceptance and understanding among the wine trade and wine drinkers. Simon describes it as misunderstood. We termed it controversial. And I just wanted to mention some reaction we'd had to our first episode. I haven't told you yet about this.
You haven't? No.
Some stuff that came through.
Really? This sounds interesting.
Okay, so we got lots of supportive comments. Great episode. Love orange wines. Fascinated by the diversity. That kind of thing. But then also one slightly ominous message, which was, love you guys, but we need to chat.
Oh dear.
So clearly from someone who is still deeply sceptical about orange wines, and happy to make that clear. So I think it's fair to say that these strong feelings both ways still persist. They're still there.
Well, yeah. Well, I think that is a good moment, isn't it, to bring in our first guest, Doug Wregg. Doug was an early adopter, we might say, of orange wines, but he's also someone who sells the stuff for a living. So he sees all sides. He is marketing director and one of 6 buyers for Les Caves de Pyrene, a UK importer, distributor and retailer that's made its name particularly for, I think, championing natural and orange wines, hasn't it?
That's fair enough, exactly. Now, Doug is a brilliant writer and communicator. He wrote the preface to Simon Wolfe's book, Amber Revolution, in which he shares some memorable quotes and phrases, including how orange wine offers a glimpse into the past and the future at the same time. It's a nice thought, isn't it?
It's a great way of putting it, actually, yeah.
Now, I caught up with him at his home in North London, actually quite near some train tracks, a major railway junction for that. So you may hear the occasional rumble.
Now, just by way of quick preface, we should clarify the WSET is the Wine and Spirit Education Trust, which is it's the leading global wine education and examination body. They run qualifications like the Higher Certificate, as was, and Diploma.
We also talk about Georgia, which obviously has a long, unbroken winemaking culture. I think their strapline is something like 8,000 vintages and counting, which is pretty cool. Within that, orange wines obviously have a very proud place. But their wines sort of slipped into slight disregard in the 20th century for various reasons, including being behind the Iron Curtain and Soviet influence, before re-emerging this century to much acclaim. Anyway, enough prefacing. I started by asking Doug what first caught his attention about orange wine.
Well, obviously, the first thing it attracts you is the colour. It's the other colour, or the new colour, or the different colour. So you cannot help but be struck by something which looks just so amazing in the glass. Seems to hold the light in a particular way. Seems to be the whole package in one, and it starts trains of thought running along various mental tracks, and you begin to wonder what it's going to taste like. Is it going to taste of what it looks like? What does it look like? Are oranges the only fruit? Will it taste of something more than that? For me, I was at that point beginning to really be interested in wine, not in terms of aromas, like primary fruity things, but more to do with texture. I was really interested in like feeling the wine in my mouth and looking for layers upon layers. And just looking at orange wines suggested to me that here was a whole genre of wine which is built on structure and layers of flavour rather than sort of single, like sort of two-dimensional flavours.
So a sort of quest for complexity.
Yes, definitely. And also to shock my palate a bit. It was as if the molecular structure or nature of my tongue had been rearranged. My palate was completely changing. Suddenly I liked or thought about the possibilities of different structures in wine, as opposed to it just being an easy drink or a good drink or whatever. I started thinking almost in three-dimensional terms because these wines were creating three-dimensional images in my mind.
So it almost blew your mind in wine terms, and literal as well as figurative sense. It was almost a sort of quantum experience. It showed you the possibility of a world beyond maybe what most people were drinking at the time.
Yes, and also I think it upset certainties, like so many people. I did the usual wine courses, diploma and higher first and then diploma, and was told that wine should be clean and clear and look like this and not like that. And suddenly here were wines which were amazing, but they weren't anything like I'd been told that wine should be like. So I began to question what was correct or notionally good or proper or clean in wine, and investigate what was more emotional, more captivating, something that would blow my mind, really. Yeah.
Very, very interesting. How have attitudes to orange wine changed over time, both among the wine trade and consumers, wine drinkers?
I mean, my first encounters with it were sort of like around 2005, and with a producer called Dario Prinčič, who is a disciple of Radikon and Grafner, who I suppose brought the idea of orange wines into the sort of modern era. I call them the new wave of orange winemakers, because I'm sure orange winemaking or skin contact winemaking has been going for many, many centuries, thousands of years even. But we didn't know about Georgian wines then, and we know a lot more now. But the European strand came out of that, and it was considered pretty revolutionary at the time. And growers like Grafner lost a lot of his previous disciples, if I can say, and then attracted a whole new breed, but influenced a lot of growers as well in that part of the world of Friuli, Slovenia. And then I can't say that they were very important part of wine lists for at least a dozen years. And then I guess the influence of those producers, particularly in Central European winemakers, and then the emergence of Georgia onto the wine scene, and the way the Georgians sort of, in a way, exported their personalities, but most of all their wine culture, to other countries. And we began to see orange wines, particularly, or skin contact wines, being shown in the major wine fairs, which sprang up around 2010, 11 and 12, like Real Wine and Raw and various other wine fairs. And suddenly people became really interested. Up to the point when it became, and I would say that things have become official when the Wine and Spirit Education Trust acknowledged their existence. So at some point, I think, the Georgian wines made it onto the curriculum. I mean, why not? When you're talking about the history of wine culture, why wouldn't you mention Georgia? And then you have to mention the way the wines were made. And then I think they began to be seen as an alternative to have on the wine list. So as sommeliers, particularly the younger breed of sommelier, were beginning to have whole sections devoted to orange wines rather than just sinking them into the whites. The fact they just demanded a discrete section, because they were neither white nor red nor obviously pink, showed that they had some validity. But from our point of view, I mean, we gradually increased the number, not because we were looking for orange wines, but because we liked what we were tasting. And also we believe that they weren't just the colour orange. I mean, they're not the colour orange. They're anything from pale gold to sort of burnt amber and everything in between. Some are textural and tannic, some are light and fruity. I mean, it just depends. There's so many methods in making an orange wine. And we liked as the variety and diversity of these wines as much as we'd like, whites or reds. I would say that I really noticed it. I noticed it before, but I noticed it most of all during the lockdown, when of our top 30 sellers, 4 in the top 10 were orange. And that was just unheard of. I mean, they wouldn't have been in the top 30 normally, or the top 50.
So why did that happen? What was it about lockdown?
I think the excitement, novelty, investigation. I think people really wanted to challenge themselves. They wanted to go up a level in terms of, what they normally wanted to drink. If you have a lot of time to sit around and play with things, play with a wine even, you can think about it. Whereas a lot of the time we just drink because we're tired and we need a bit of refreshment or a little booze. You wouldn't necessarily drink an orange wine for that. But if you're making a nice dinner, and these wines are incredibly gastronomic, and they also, a lot of them really last the course. I mean, if you can bear not to drink them for a night, finish them, then they might still be there 3 or 4 days later in even better condition. So there are a lot of things that people were finding out about these wines. And I suppose in a weird way, they became emblematic of natural wine. If you had to sort of say what has really, come about in the last 10, 15 years, you say, well, natural wines, orange wines, they're almost sort of congruent, when we're talking about them. I think increasingly, if we're regarding orange wines as closer to reds and spirit than whites, that was the big sort of shift, I think, is because people thought they were almost an aberration or an offset of a white wine, whereas in fact they weren't, because there aren't white grapes and there aren't red grapes. There's every colour under the sun, grey, pink, purple, you name it, golden. But it was just skin contact.
And how do these wines sell? How do orange wines sell from a sort of commercial perspective both in shops and restaurants. Is it a hard sell, or is it becoming increasingly easy?
Well, I think you mentioned, I think that there's a generation that have grown up now with natural wines and orange wines, and I think that they sell very well. And I think a lot of a lot of it's producer driven as well as importer driven. So I think a lot of producers like to challenge themselves to do something. So they'll make one orange cuvee, not everything's going to be orange, but they like the idea of playing with skin contact and texture in their wines. So we work with very few producers now who won't make an orange wine, which is quite interesting. And that's a real culture change as well, because I guess they see the commercial possibility of the wines. I think the other thing is a gastronomic reason. Like we eat so many dishes with so many different flavors. Orange wines or skin contact wines work so well with so many different things, whether it's meat or cheese or fish or whatever. They're incredibly versatile. You only have to go to countries like Georgia and have like your 16 courses, 16 different dishes on the table and one jug of wine, and it's always an orange wine or a skin contact wine. You think, yeah, that works with everything. That's funnily enough.
And do you think it's sort of slightly restaurant led then? Is it restaurants, or are you seeing lots of selling in shops?
It's probably easier to sell in restaurants, just simply because if it's being given a section in a list and a sommelier or wine waiter or whoever is, can be recommending these wines. I will say that we work with a lot of internet retailers. This is another phenomenon that sprang up after lockdown, and a lot of them, specifically request those wines. And I think it's a point of difference, and it's the association with artisan wines, unique wines, wines with very special flavors that you will probably not see on the high street or in supermarkets. They're ubiquitous without being totally overexposed.
And what do you make of the orange wine in supermarkets? The sort of small sector that's developing of a sort of more mass-produced slightly style of orange wine.
I think it's a bit thin, really. It's all right. Like a lot of people say, well, you can make natural wine, you can make no sulfur wine in a technical way, but I don't want it to be technical. I want, I strongly believe that orange wines or skin contact wines can and should have as much terroir expression as whites or reds. So, and why wouldn't you want to, make the best of it? A winemaker once said to me, we, grow grapes all year round. The vineyard works in this, I'm farming really well. Vineyard works in this particular way. Why do I throw away the part of the grape that has the most value? I'm not just making juice, for 12 months and then aging it for another 24 months. If I'm using the skins, I'm using something which, has like all this aromatic potential. All this tannic potential, antioxidants, all these like really good quality, microbiological ingredients, but then most people just throw it away. So I think when it's mass produced, then, you're really just wanting the color, aren't you? It's almost to say I'm making an orange wine. It's not really about making something which is a pure terroir expression, and using the maximum potential that the grapes give you.
So it's more a marketing exercise than a true belief in making an orange wine.
I'm sure. I'm not going to be a snob and say that, there's no point, no reason not to have a gateway to this. And if it introduces people to a style of wine that they didn't know existed, well, that's the first step. And hopefully they will go to the next level and go to the next level. What it should be noted is that, a $4.99, $5.99 orange wine is not going to be a real wine, but it can't be a real wine anyway, because, grapes are worth a lot more than that if they're properly farmed.
Doug, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
So, quite a lot of stuff to chew over there. Now, Doug mentioned in that interview the producer Dario Prinčič. We are definitely going to be coming on to that particular producer, aren't we?
I'm surprised you can say his name, actually.
Well, there we go. Wait and see. But, I was intrigued by how lockdown kind of turbocharged their sales of orange wines. People were a bit bored, weren't they? They were looking to have some fun, do something a bit different. And I guess they were sort of then keen to explore interesting new things?
Yeah, I'm not sure we did, but obviously, clearly, a lot of other people did. They had better ideas than us. I don't know. What were we exploring? Anyway, I
We were
agree.
just drinking.
Absolutely intriguing, wasn't it? He told me they had 3 orange wines selling 400 to 500 cases a month at one point during lockdown, which he described as ridiculous.
Really?
That kind of thing
Really?
never happens.
They normally don't get anything like that.
It went berserk.
It's interesting that it's orange wine.
I think we've talked in the past about lockdown, haven't we? How the pandemic sort of accelerated certain trends, like the move to online shopping, which we've all heard about. And
inevitable,
wine
really,
as well.
wasn't it? Yeah.
Which incidentally, Doug mentioned as being good for orange wine because you kind of online, you have time and space to put wines in context and maybe manipulate what people see as the retailer. So you can introduce people to new things if they're open to that kind of thing. That was an interesting thing he mentioned as well.
Yeah, and I mean, Doug obviously thinks, like Simon Wolfe, that orange wine is here to stay and that it's continuing to develop as producers are experimenting more and more.
Absolutely. I think that's a key thing. But, to follow on from what Doug told me about lockdown sales of orange wines, he was also quite honest about orange wine sales in general. So, I was asking about that. Le Cave has about 2,000 wines on its books, apparently, of which around 120 are orange, so it's about 5% by volume of the list. But they tend to sell less than 5%. So clearly still not the easiest sell commercially. And that's largely, to be fair, because decent orange wine, as Doug explained, isn't cheap if it's made properly. It's not an easy style to make. You're using organic farming, which is really important, of course, if you're going to be macerating the skins for a long time, as Gravner, we talked about with the Gravner interview. And also they have things like long aging and careful handling. These things just they're not cheap to make.
But they have got 120 wines, 120 orange
120
wines, which
orange
is
wines.
quite
worth a route around.
Yeah, I mean,
it's
that's
a really
quite extraordinary, isn't
selection.
it? But it also reminds me of what Simon said about orange wine never being able to replicate the commercial success of Provençal rosé. But that's probably a good thing. Anyway, we're also going to discuss, aren't we, this issue of how commercial orange wine can and should be. I was also interested when Doug said some people saw orange wine as an aberration of white in the early days, when actually it should be considered more like a subset of red. Because of the way it's fermented, I guess.
Yeah, no, I like that. I think that's a really good way to think about it, because then you start judging tannin, colour, mouthfeel, longevity or age-worthiness, all of these things through a really sort of constructive and positive lens rather than the opposite.
Yeah.
If you think this is white and then it tastes like that, it's weird. If you think about it, it's kind of red in a way. But yeah, no, absolutely. And I guess if you think about the bigger historical perspective, it's actually the clean, fresh, modern, reductive white wines, the sort of the historic anomaly, an aberration, if you like. Not these orange wines. We've only been able to make these modern whites in the last century or so with sort of modern winemaking techniques and well-sealed bottles.
Yes, so really the historic norm has been orange wine.
Absolutely.
Or something similar to it, because that's what you'd have had to make if you had very basic winemaking kit. And also if you wanted your white wines to age, because the skins give natural protection against oxidation, which would not have been easy to achieve in the past.
Just to finish with Doug, we did discuss the famous Terroir natural wine bar in London, which was under the same ownership as Le Cave de Pyrene and ran from, I think, about 2008 to 2021. Doug described it as phenomenally successful, where people could explore beyond the identikit branded experience of most London wine bars. He said their aim with Terroir was to be deliberately irreverent and subvert expectations, to sort of help people unlearn, in his words, everything they knew about wine. The question was, would the public accept it?
Yeah, and he had some good stories about their customers, didn't he?
He did, absolutely. So apparently in the early days, he saw some people freaking out, as he said, when they asked for a Pinot Grigio and expected something bland and colourless, but instead got this massive,
can you imagine?
Tannic, funky, reddish orange liquid. But then, over time, people got really into it. There were queues around the block, that they were turning people away, and he noticed that customers were beginning to sort of educate not only themselves, but also their fellow diners about orange wines on the restaurant floor. So, it was a sort of communal education, just a massive party, and people got really excited about it.
Yeah, but I mean, but it ended up closing, didn't it, in 2021, I think,
it did.
wasn't
and
it?
I think, they were phenomenally successful in their time. We loved it too. So did lots of people, including David Dowling, our listener who asked the question. But then I think with competition and landlords hiking rent, they ended up having to close,
Right.
amongst other things. So, I think perhaps the most valuable contribution of terroir was proof of concept that this movement was here to stay, orange wines included.
And so it has proved. Right. Coming up, we get an insight into legendary orange wine producer Radikon, and we taste some stimulating orange wines. To recap so far, orange wine is here to stay as a commercial category, even if it may never be the most mass market of propositions. Lockdown seemed to turbocharge sales of orange wine, no doubt in part because people had more time on their hands to consider their online wine purchases and to seek out something new. Today, orange wine's suitability with food and refreshing point of difference suggest a bright future ahead.
Now, you mentioned the future, but I'd like to take us back to the past for a moment, if that's okay.
It's fine, but keep it brief.
Oh, okay, here we go.
We've got a lot to get through.
Brief history of time.
Brief.
Orange wine. Maybe that was the book that Stephen Hawking was meaning to write, actually. Maybe that's what Brief History of Time is actually about. It's about orange wine.
Orange wine.
Anyway, massive
Everything's
secret.
about orange.
Spoiler there. But no, in our last episode, Matea Gravner touched on Oslavia, this tiny village in the Friuli Collio hills of northeast Italy, right next to the Slovenian border. We're just north of the Adriatic Sea here, where there's this hotbed of orange wine production, including, hallowed names like Gravner and Radikon and Prinčič, who we're just about to come on to.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't really get a chance to explore all that, did we? And it's an intriguing little nook or cranny in the wine world, a really hilly region straddling the Italian-Slovenian border, as you say, running from Friuli into the Brda region of Slovenia. Bit rainy, vines everywhere, quite traditional, but the history is what's interesting, isn't it?
Exactly. So this is a part of the world that suffered in the 20th century. In World War I, the 12 battles of Isonzo, named after the river that flows through this area, ground on over 2 years and saw nearly 2 million soldiers, 1.75 million soldiers killed or wounded. That's worse than the Somme or Passchendaele, which we hear so much about. Oslavia, the village, was utterly destroyed and had to be completely rebuilt afterwards.
Yeah, and things were also tough again in World War II, especially with Mussolini's persecution of anyone perceived to be non-Italian, including families of Slovenian origin in Friuli, which means the Gravners and Radikons and many of the winemaking fraternity there.
Because the truth is that the frontier is an impermanent thing in this part of the world. It's shifted a lot over the years, and equally it's meant different things at different times. So at one point it was the boundary between Italy and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, sort of before World War I, with Oslavia on the side of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then after World War II, the frontier became part of the extended Iron Curtain, effectively, between the Western world and Yugoslavia, which is part of the Soviet alliance. This time, with Yugoslavia on the Italian side.
And things have changed since too, but I guess from a wine perspective, what we're getting at is, could this history and geography, these constantly shifting cultural paradigms, be partly the reason why wine producers in this particular area have chosen to go back to their roots, to express their identity in wine rather than passports or language or nationality or whatever? In a place where your culture is suppressed, like Georgia under Soviet control or Oslavia destroyed in World War I, you instinctively strive to resist and find other ways to express your true identity.
It's a really interesting theory, and it makes total sense. And what Simon Wolf writes in his book is that orange wine, this orange style, is historic to this area. In fact, he cites a book written in 1844 by Slovene writer, priest and farmer Matija Vertovec, if that's the right pronunciation, who recommending macerating white wines with the skins for up to 30 days. That is orange wine. So for these families of Slovenian origin in Italy, that would be a perfect way to reflect their identity and history. But I guess really it's the history of this whole area, not just certain nationalities. As we say, the border is a shifting thing.
And of course, as we discussed, it just happens to work really well with the local grape variety, Ribolla Gialla. So at this point, let's bring in Saša Radikon. Saša is the son of Stanko Radikon, a former car mechanic and then iconoclastic innovator who, along with Joško Gravner, was a pioneer in terms of reviving and reinventing orange wine in the mid to late 1990s on his family wine estate. Stanko remembered his grandfather macerating his Ribolla Gialla grapes, partly to ensure the family's wine would last the whole year without spoiling. And when Stanko went back to that method, he also stopped adding sulfites to his wines. So a pioneer in that regard too.
Now, sadly, Stanko died all too early in 2016, but his son Saša took up the reins and continues to work with the family on the estate. His sister Ivana actually does most of the day-to-day winemaking now, apparently. When I spoke to Saša, he was just back from a big sales trip to North America. But I started by asking Saša what made his father Stanko switch back to orange wine.
My father always said that if you like something, it will work. And in that period, he was really into this style of wines. He basically feel that this will be the future. He was right, now we know. And he wasn't mainly able to do the wines he used to do before because he didn't like them anymore.
What makes skin contact whites or orange whites so special?
I think that the biggest part of this is having the grapes and the skins of the grapes are the part which are more in contact with materials, with sun, with the rain, with everything is outside, with the wind. And this every vintage is different, and then every grape of the different vintage has different informations which are mainly held inside the skins. And I think the biggest part, obviously we know, even scientifically, that the biggest part of the flavors, the biggest part of everything, it's close to the skin. Then the skin are holding the biggest part of the flavor of the grapes. Then if you eat the grape whole, you have a certain type of sensations. If you only take the juice from inside, you obviously miss a part of the flavor which you can have in the grapes. And then the same way for the wine. If you make only wine with the juice of the grape, you can only have a part of all these flavors and consistency of the grape.
It's ironic, isn't it? Because some people criticize orange wines for being standardized. They say that skin contact is a standardizing technique, whereas what you're saying is completely the opposite.
Yes, it is. But these people, when they talk, maybe they think that all the red wines are standardized. This is my question. I mean, if we do the skin contact for reds and we think that they are better than without, why we don't do the same thing with white grapes? And if we do a skin contact, we can have much better extraction and everything for the rest. And I think the same thing it's valid for whites.
Absolutely. And what can I ask you about Ribolla Gialla in particular? What is it about this particular grape, your grape, one of your grapes, that works so well with skin contact?
It's mainly because Ribolla Gialla works very well with skin contact because the skins of these grapes are very thick. And then you basically, if you only press, you only have a part of the juice which is much less intense, much less full of flavor. If you make a skin contact, you are able to extract all this part of the thick skin you basically have in the grape. It's for example, if you make a skin contact, a direct press Ribolla Gialla, everybody here there's a lot of people who are making it, and you can have only a wine which can be an easy wine as an aperitif without any big structure. And this kind of wine is not able to compete with the Chardonnay, with the Sauvignon, with the intensity of the flavors and of the taste of this wine. But if you make a skin contact, then you extract the biggest part of the flavor, which is in the skin, you can really compete on the same level with these big French varieties.
You once compared it to Chateau Petrus. There was a comparison with Chateau Petrus you made, I've read. Could you remind me what that was?
If you have the grapes of Merlot and you have a direct press, you have a light wine. And if you make a skin contact with the same Merlot, you can have a wine which can be Chateau Petrus. And the biggest difference is the skin contact.
Trite question, I know, but do you feel Slovenian or Italian or European or something else?
I like to say I'm the best part of both, Slovenian and Italian. My culture is based on Italian culture and Slovenian culture. My first language was Slovenian, but my most used language is Italian. Then this is the biggest. I mean, it's difficult to say. I like to say I am from Oslavia, where I live, where I stay.
You're Oslavian, fine.
Exactly.
What's your advice on aging orange wine?
It depends a lot of the wine you have in front. It depends. Many long skin contact wines, they age very, very well. We are still opening bottles from 2000, 2001, and they are still very good, still very fresh. Some of the vintages, I think, they are not able to age so long, but I can say you that some of the wines, they after 15 or 20 years, they are still good. Some of them, they lose a little bit of the freshness.
Why do you think orange wines have become so popular?
Because they are good. And I think that the biggest thing is not, we have to look at what is happening even in the food culture. I think the food changed a lot, the wines we are drinking. Years ago, I mean, 15 to 20 years ago, you go to the best restaurant and you can have some very good fish, very easy, not complicated, but very easy fish, or you can have just a filet, which was very not elaborated food. Now, if you go to the same restaurant, probably you will have the same fish, but completely in a different way of cooking or a different way of presenting the dish. It means that we have more flavors. We are looking more for the balance in our mouth. In the same way, the orange wines, they can mainly better adapt to the different kind of flavors the chef they are using in the kitchen.
What does the future hold for orange wine and for Radikon?
I can tell you for Radikon, because I think we are keep going with the same wines. We love these wines. We are keep going to do that. The future for orange wines, I think, it will be a bit different. I think, because at the moment there's a lot of people joining the world, and some of them they are good, some of them they are not. I think that this thing about orange wines will stay on the map for forever, I hope. And I think that slowly we have a selection of producers which they really think in this kind of wine. And in the same way, some of them, they will leave the world of orange wines, probably.
Saša, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Orange wines are popular because they're good. And his dad had said as much, hadn't he? The skins are good. And if you argue skin contact standardises whites, then by logic, you have to discount all reds. Too.
Exactly. No, it's a fair enough argument. And also, it depends entirely on the place and the people. You know, not all places or grapes are all people can make good orange wine. I did like his Chateau Petrus analogy
it's
too.
Quite funny,
that was actually something he'd said before, and I'd read it, and I wanted him to repeat it.
Yeah.
He'd basically said, you know, talking about the time before they started using the skin contact method with their white wines, he'd said, for years, it's as if we were just making rosé out of the grapes of Chateau Petrus, which is a lovely sort of analogy.
Would have been a great rosé, I suppose.
Yeah,
but I also picked up, of course, on how he says one of the main selling points for orange wine is their ability to go with a range of foods, which is exactly what Doug and Simon both said. And I think we'd agree, wouldn't
totally.
we? And, of course, we're going to come on to your lamb litmus test in a moment.
Prepare to be blown away buy that one or just feel very, very confused. Both states coexist in my mind permanently, I think. Anyway, just before we get on to the tasting, there were a couple of points about the future to relate as regards Radikon. Firstly, Saša revealed exclusively that they're embarking on a new project on the Slovenian side of the border, building a winery, making a wine from a field blend of old varieties like Ribolla, Tocai Friulano and Malvasia Istriana. The first wine was the 2023 vintage, so it's already made. It's coming out later this year.
Oh, that is a revelation, isn't it?
Juicy
newsflash. We don't get many of those, but here we go. Let's make the most of it.
There we are. One to look out for. But also in terms of the future, I asked about sort of Radikon's relationship with Gravner, because it was widely known that Josko and Stanko, the two sort of main orange wine revivalists and collaborators, like you said, they had a big falling out and they split at some stage. But Saša made a point of saying that in his father's last years, Stanko and Josko reconciled. And now Saša and Josko share a lot these days, which is really interesting to hear. Plus, there's a really sort of tight group of top producers in Oslavia who work together. So that's sort of really heartening to hear, and I think it bodes well.
It is very good to hear.
You always hear that.
Right. On that note of peace and harmony, we have a couple of wines to disagree about, don't we? What a surprise.
We do.
Nobody will be surprised.
Let's dive headlong into this. First up is the hard-to-pronounce Mlečnik Chardonnay 2017. I think it's pronounced Mlecnik, Mlečnik Chardonnay 2017 from Vipava in Slovenia. Now, I love this wine, partly because it's like it says Chardonnay on the label, but it's not like any other Chardonnay I've ever had. It's, and I think that's maybe why you're not quite so keen.
Possibly.
It's sort of, look at it. It's burnt amber in colour. It smells much fresher than it looks, which is good. But it's sort of leesy, yeasty, sort of dried peach aromas. I find it intriguing, and it kind of it captivates you with your eyes to start with, but then it draws you in with the smell. And then on the palate, it's got this lovely sort of acidity, minerality, and roasted nuts. It's quite gentle but complex and really beguiling. For me, it's like an orange take on Grand Cru Chablis. It's sort of savoury, it's intriguing, it's layered, it's not overpowering, it's quite elegant in a way. I love it.
I agree, it is different. It's hard to describe, although you've done a very good job there. But it is foodie, which I know is a bit of a loose term, but it is sort of foodie. I just don't think I find it as winning as you do, perhaps.
Okay,
so it's not that. Well, it's not that I don't like it. Or I think it's not good. I guess I'm slightly boringly agnostic about this one.
Okay, fair enough.
One that I do like, and I think we both like, is an English orange wine. The Vagabond Solena Batch 002, made by Jose Quintana from the Ortega grape variety grown in Oxfordshire. Now, it's a blend here of vintages, 2018, 21 and 22. It's quite pale for an orange wine, but it definitely has chalky tannins and an exotic sort of orange pith and red apple notes. There's a bit of oak here. It's old oak, and it's sort of made in a form of a Solera system. So you get that slightly leesy, oaky, but it's only in the background, and it almost gives more texture than anything. So it's a bit different for an English Ortega.
Totally different. I mean, it's my favourite English Ortega, I think. It's totally intriguing. It's something really different. And it's really complex and layered. It's really multi-dimensional. As you say, it cries out for food. It speaks of England in a way, doesn't it? The bright acidity. But then on top of that, it delivers these extra layers and complexity from the skin contact. I think it's really well made.
Yeah, I agree. And we went to visit Jose, didn't we, recently? And we were very impressed. He's a really interesting winemaker, and in fact is going to be appearing on Wine Blast before too long.
Indeed, he is. Without putting too many spoilers out there, but for now we move on to a wine we certainly do not agree on. The aforementioned Dario Prinčič Bianco Sivi 2020. We've got the bottle in front of us. You are glowering at it, or maybe it's glowering at you. I don't know. Anyway, this was the producer name checked by Doug Wregg, another famous Oslavia resident, along with Radikon and Gravner. And Dario Prinčič makes hugely celebrated and really quite pricey wines. But you're not a fan of this wine, are you?
No. And I'm very aware, people listening to this who know the wine may well disagree with me. I'm sure Doug will. But there you go. You know, it looks like a sort of a kind of cloudy 10-year-old tawny port, which is fine.
Yep.
I can't say I find it particularly attractive compared to some other orange wines, but I'm not too worried about that. It's more I'm afraid, overpowering scent of nail varnish remover. You know, it's really kind of heady and volatile. And then you taste it, and I mean, the tannins are very prominent.
Yeah.
And then it sort of catches the back of your throat a bit like red wine vinegar. I mean, I just don't get it. I don't enjoy drinking it, more to the point. And, you know, I am pretty open to fairly funky wines, as you know. So I don't think that's a problem for me. It's just this wine doesn't work for me.
Beyond that, it's glorious though, right?
You can drink it. You get the whole bottle to yourself.
Well, happy days. I agree. It's a bit bonkers as a wine. I agree. But, you know, in a way, that's why I like it. It dares to be different. So, you know, first up, it's made from Pinot Grigio, which we always criticise for being bland and boring and life's too short.
It's not bland and boring.
But this is a Pinot Grigio, which is the absolute opposite of that. It's almost got too much character. So, you know, you can't win.
No, you
can't win.
There's a middle ground.
I agree. You know, the colour is a slightly disturbing sort of garnet ruby. That's okay. And definitely there are sort of hints of tawny port or Madeira on the nose. Definitely some sort of high tone notes. But for me, they don't actually dominate. They work to sort of lift the other elements, like the red berry and sort of pear aromas. And then, yes, absolutely, on the palate, the acidity is tense. The tannins are really firm. It's all going on. I mean, it's intense, almost chaotic. But it's also juicy and fun. It's like, I don't know, it's like a mad roller disco on your palate.
Oh, well, maybe you see that's where I draw the line. Even as a child of the 80s, I have never liked roller discos. So there you go.
I never knew that about you.
You do now.
Cancel plans for next weekend. Anyway, there we are. I mean, I get that. I get that. You know, it's full on. It's attention grabbing. The VA is high. Volatile acidity is high. So, you know, almost borderline faulty. I agree with that. But for me, it sort of walks a tightrope, and it does work. I keep coming back to it and wanting more. You know, it's a bit Marmite, but I love Marmite.
Yeah, well, you can have it. That's fine. I've tried it, and I've tried it again, and I've tried it with food, and yeah, it just doesn't work.
I'm not convincing.
No, it either to me, even with food, it either clashes or it dominates. So for me, it's just too much, too crazy, too faulty, in my opinion. I know volatility is a risk when you ferment some wines with skins because the cap can go acetic, and this is just, it's too much for me.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. I suppose I'm wrong in this.
No, nobody's wrong. Nobody is wrong.
You are such a delicate wallflower. We can't overwhelm your taste buds. So we will leave that there. Anyway, that wasn't patronising. It was very affectionate. Can I just read you the tasting note for this wine from Buon Divino, who sell this wine in California?
I get the feeling they like it more than I do. Don't they?
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
But what it is also is quite honest, as well as being quite funny. So I'm just going to read this really quickly.
Yeah, go for it.
A downright kaleidoscopic interpretation of an oft mistreated grape when in conventional hands. Dario's Pinot Grigio more than benefits from some serious skin maceration and his masterful touch. Pulled from 60-year-old vines on steeply terraced soils, a dark pink amber colour. Sivi is vibrant and ever-changing with blood orange and plums, honey and caramel, balsamic and minerals. The flavour palette twists and turns in all the right ways. Apricot skin, mandarin and ginger surge across the tongue as spiced rhubarb and cherries mingle with smoked tamarind and bergamot tea with red currants. Be ready for some volatile acidity and earthy tannins, and be rocked by the depth of flavour and rich texture of this wine. Not just a great Pinot Grigio, a wine that exudes and embraces individuality. I mean, that is positively Shakespearean. As an actress yourself, how can you resist?
It's also not cheap, is it? It's about £50 at Cave de Pyrene, or $64 at Buon Divino.
You can take the actress out of Yorkshire, but you can't take
the Yorkshire girl out of me. So I would say you pay your money, you take your chances. It's over to you guys. But I don't think there's any way you and I are going to end up seeing eye to eye on this one. So let's park it.
Fair enough. Now, just to finish, we were also discussing what makes an orange wine a proper orange wine, weren't we? You mentioned this earlier. Doug mentioned there are some pretty cynical so-called orange wines coming out made by big producers, which he wouldn't term real orange wines. And we would probably agree, having tasted and rejected a fair few for this episode, wouldn't we?
Yes, I mean, so I guess the question is, what constitutes a real orange wine? Is it the colour, or what the label says it is, or something else?
Exactly. And as we tasted and chatted, we agreed it has to go beyond colour and labels. You know, what makes an orange wine properly orange is the texture. You know, it has to have some element of tannins or mouthfeel that makes it clear this wine was made with the skins. It can be subtle, it can soften over time, but it has to be there.
Or otherwise it's not really orange. And if you think about reds, it's a similar thing. Reds with no tannins at all tend to be pretty dull.
Totally. Good orange wine needs to have that thrill. You know, it absolutely cannot be boring. So that's why I came up with my lamb litmus test.
Oh, here we go.
So we're often looking for a good match for lamb, and often a full-bodied white is best because reds can clash or overwhelm what can be a pretty delicate meat. You agreeing with me so far? Okay.
Oh, definitely. Whites with lamb, I love.
Exactly. Yeah. But then you think orange wine is white with tannins. So it's perfect with lamb. You've got everything that you want there. And that turns out to be true, as we've found. But it needs to have the tannin to work really well, to engage with the meaty flavours of the lamb. So therefore, an orange wine that matches well with lamb is a proper orange wine. An orange wine that doesn't fails the lamb litmus test.
I'm not sure it's foolproof, given not every orange wine will match well with lamb. There are so many styles out there. And to be fair, so many different cuts of lamb and ways of cooking it.
All right.
But I like your logic. And I think especially, in all honesty, the being serious about it, the orange wines needing a bit of tannin, which then works well with meat in general, let's be honest.
All right. So I get sort of half-hearted C+ for my lamb litmus test idea.
No, it's a good one.
It was just an idea.
It's a nice idea.
I think you're also still a bit antsy after the Prinčič wine, but there we go. We go on. And before we finish, we did set ourselves one question we had to answer at the end of all of this. So over to you. Is orange wine actually any good?
Well, my objections to individual wines aside, I'd say an unqualified yes to this question. I mean, of course, there are bad examples and some overly commercial styles, but you get those in every wine category. And there are some brilliant ones too, you know, really, really original and delicious. And we've tasted excellent orange wines from so many different places, certainly over the last few years.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And I add, we're seeing orange wine just get better and better too, which will inevitably happen over time as more and more people experiment with it, you know, find out what works and then get those on the market. So it's not only good, it's exciting too. So to my mind, we should all embrace this fourth wine colour.
Hallelujah. A great point to end on, I think. By way of closing summary, orange wine can polarise, as we know, but it can also excite. It's a category with huge potential and some outstanding examples leading the way. You've got from iconic producers like Gravner and Radikon to those in Georgia, Spain, Portugal, Greece, England, Chile, and beyond. This is a wine style going global and reclaiming its historic place at a great global wine table. The future is definitely orange tinted.
2 quick plugs before we finish. If you'd like to get 20% off Simon Wolf's excellent book on orange wine, see the link in our show notes. That offer lasts until the 1st of March 2024. Plus, if you're UK based and this show has whetted your appetite for orange and natural wines, head to the Real Wine Fair on the 28th and 29th of April 2024 in London's Tobacco Dock, where you might even see a lesser spotted Doug Wregg having his tongue rearranged.
So thanks to Doug and Saša Radikon, and thanks to you for listening. Until next time, cheers.